Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. This lecture is Great Games in the French Defense, and I want to thank our sponsor Tom Gall. I've known Tom since before all of you were born, and he wants to dedicate this lecture to his dad who's recovering, so have a quick recovery, and I hope you enjoy the lecture also. And I had games suggested by Tom, and I didn't see why I should override the sponsor's wishes, so we're going to look at those games. So if you don't like the games, then you can blame the sponsor, or you can blame my analysis of the games. First, let me share the screen, since I forgot to do that. Hooray, I shared the screen. Okay, and I usually start with something on the internet about the topic before I look at games. One of the bigger chess opening articles that I've seen on Wikipedia is on the French defense, actually. So it's a good primer if you don't know what the French defense is, or if you want to know what the different variations are. And so it talks about different pawn structures in the beginning, and it talks about different variations, and shows lots of diagrams, talks about sidelines, the names of the variations, and then at the end, after it talks about all of that, pretty thorough, I think. It even talks about which players like certain variations, talks about the history. And I heard this a long time ago when I was a kid, but sometimes these things are apocryphal, so you don't know if they're true. But there was a correspondence game between London and Paris in the 1800s, and the Paris players played E6, and so it's called the French defense. Not sure if any of that's true, but the legend lives on. Then they talk about which players in this paragraph included the French defense in their repertoire, or as their main repertoire. Then, for those of you who are as old as I am, they talk about the ECO codes of each variation, C00 to C19. But I guess nobody uses that anymore. But you know, if people watch this who are older, then maybe you'll, you know. So it's a pretty big article on the French defense. Also of note, since I'm giving the lecture, so I can talk about whatever I want to talk about. When I was a teen and a preteen, the French defense was my main opening for black. And I didn't play E4 very often, still don't. So mainly I had French defense for black. And I'm sure in rated play over the board, I've had the French defense with black probably more than 200 times. Although, frankly, none of those games are something that I would look at. Then, sometime in my late teens and early 20s, I started playing the Sicilian more than the French, and the Karjakin occasionally. Occasionally, I played E5. So probably E5 and C5 were my main weapons in my 20s and 30s. Then I throw in the French defense occasionally because I used to play it a lot. So the French defense is basically black wants to play D5, but doesn't want to take on D5 with the queen, which would be the Scandinavian. So the French defense is E4, E6. And you can also attempt to play D5 protecting it with a pawn like the French defense does by playing the move c6, which is the Karjakin. The drawback to the Karjakin is if you want to attack the center with c5, which we often see in the French, you're losing a tempo because you're playing c6 and c5. And the negative part of the French defense is our starting position here, the bishop on c8 is blocked by the pawn. Another person who plays the French defense a lot, and by a lot I mean every game with black against e4, is my wife Karen. So Karen always plays the French defense when she's black against e4, and when I was a teenager, I always played the French defense. And we're going to see different variations today in the games that were suggested. Basically, white can do many different moves here, but I have a funny story. I was playing Yasser Seirawan in the US Championship, I don't know, around 2011. I'm within a year. It's either 2010, 11, or 12. And I had white, and I don't play e4 very often. And I said, well, if I play e4, he'll either play the Karjakin or the French. And when I prepared against the French, I was looking at Yasser's games in the French. And I was wondering what Yasser did in the exchange variation, because typically I was playing knight f3 and then an early c4. And I got a list of all of Yasser's games with black against the French for my database, and I couldn't find any exchange Frenches. Well, it turned out Yasser played the Karjakin, so that didn't matter. I did my Karjakin prep, I got an advantage, and then I got outplayed and lost. But when the game ended, I said, when I prepared for you, I didn't know if you'd play the Karjakin and the French. And I was going to play the exchange variation, but I was confused because I couldn't find any of your games. And Yasser went like this. No, I don't think I've ever faced the exchange variation. I mean, Yasser played the Karjakin, played the French defense for 30 years and claims he never faced the exchange variation, and I couldn't find any examples of it. So I was very confused because a lot of people who play the French, for some reason, they don't like facing the exchange variation because you get a symmetrical position where it's white's move. So I guess you'd rather have white because it's white's move, it's the same position. And you don't really get French defense kind of positions. Conversely, my wife Karen, if I was guessing, I think the move that she faces most often is the exchange variation. I think she's played over 100 games rated, and most people play the exchange variation. Okay, but at the higher levels, typically we're not seeing that very often. Now, on the other hand, we do get exchange French positions at the top level because sometimes after we play the exchange, if white plays knight f3 and black plays knight f6, which is not a given, this position can occur from the Petrov. It's rare, but it happens. In this position, white used to only play d4. Now white's playing knight c3. And if white plays d3 and then d4, which is also played, and black plays d5, this is the exchange French with Petrov move order. Same position. Okay, but typically at the super grandmaster level, which all of these games are, we're not going to see a lot of exchange Frenches. Now, this game was played in Vikonsee in 2010 between Karjakin and Magnus Carlsen. This game was played such a long time ago that Magnus was only 28-10. Terrible. Although he's still a lot higher rated than Karjakin. And this is way before their world championship match, which happened several years later. Magnus, not known to play the French defense, so probably a surprise weapon. Okay, and when I was a kid, I always played the Winawer with bishop b4, which we're going to see later in the lecture. I think the main move now, the most common move, the grandmaster level, is knight f6. And this is the move that Karen plays when she faces knight c3. e5 is the main move, knight d7. Typically, white plays f4. And then this position has been seen in thousands of grandmaster games with lots of results, white winning, black winning draw. It's a big fight. Okay, and Karjakin is known in the chess world for not losing with white. However, in this lecture, the people who have white are going to be known for losing with white. So truth hurts. Okay, bishop e3 is the main move. Bishop e7 is one move. Black can also play queen b6, or c takes d4, or a6. They've all been played. Bishop e7 is relatively unusual. Queen d2. Carlsen quickly castles. And sometimes white castles queenside, and we get a very exciting game where we have dueling pawn storms. Black's attacking on the queen side against white's king, and white attacks on the king side against black's king. But Karjakin decided to play it safe and played bishop e2, and then after a6 he castled king side. So I guess nobody's going to get checkmated because they castled on the same side. White has two advantages. White has more space in the center, pawns on e5, and black's bishop isn't perfect, not so good. However, the d5 pawn, which happens in the French defense, is defended by the e pawn, and the white's d4 pawn is not defended by a pawn. So we can trade a side pawn for a center pawn, sort of like we do in the Sicilian. Occasionally, variations in the Sicilian and the French defense look like each other because the pawn structure is similar. Magnus played b5, king h1, put it in h, queen c7, a3, not very interesting so far. Bishop b7, we have no trades, nothing's been captured. Rook d1, and it looks like both sides have done what they wanted to do. Eventually, something has to happen with the tension where things are traded and things open up. And the two ideas that black has in the French defense variations where the pawn is on e5, which is a lot of them, are to play c5, attacking the d pawn, and f6, attacking the e pawn. Sometimes black plays one, and sometimes black plays both, but playing neither is pretty rare because we want to attack white center. Okay, so he played rook c8, still building. Queen e1, the queen wants to go over to the king side. And finally, things got opened up and traded. And typically in the French defense, when I was playing it 40 years ago, I liked trading pieces with black because I got checkmated less often. And I noticed in my own games, either my king got in a lot of trouble or I had a much better end game. So, if white plays, queen g3 and f5 and f6, you could see that black's king could get in trouble. But if black trades all the pieces off, then white's not going to checkmate black, and black's going to have a nice half-open c-file, a nice center pawn, and black's position's fine. Karjakin played queen h4, which the engine does not like. It says that's a mistake. They traded on d4, and Magnus played the other idea, f6, and the e5 pawn is quite attacked. It's attacked 3 times, and it's defended once. So that means white has to trade on f6 eventually. First, Karjakin threatened the h7 pawn, but Magnus saw it. And now white has to do something about the e5 pawn. So he takes, and Magnus takes with the rook. The engine already slightly prefers black here because black has a target on f4, which he can attack with the queen, the rook, the other rook. The knight can go to c5 and perhaps e4 or take the bishop. Black can play e5. And I'm not really sure what white should do with these pieces. How to get something going. Black has 2 center pawns and white has 0. So already black is doing well. He played f5 because his pawn's going to be a target and it's going to be pinned. So I mean, if black could cheat, he would just play rook f8 and e5, and you pin on the f pawn. It means the black's already winning. Also in black's favor is this rook is very suspicious on d4. Typically, you don't want your rook in the center of the board there where it can get harassed. Okay, so f5, he's trying to give black an isolated pawn in the center. Rook f8, pinning the pawn. You can't take because not only do you lose your rook, but you get checkmated. I'm not sure which is worse. Okay, so Karjakin played rook g1, getting out of the pin. And Magnus played knight c5, improving his knight. If he plays something like e5, which looks good, then I can sacrifice the exchange, but it's not really a sacrifice because I get the exchange back immediately by attacking the queen and the rook. So he plays knight c5. Karjakin takes the e6 pawn. Magnus takes with the knight. And white's rook looks kind of silly, but typically in the French defense, white will have a pawn, a knight, or a bishop on d4, blocking the d5 pawn. And in this instance, your rook is attacked, and eventually I'm going to play d4, and my bishop is going to be very happy on b7. It hasn't been happy the whole game, but once I play d4, it's going to be pretty happy. So he saved his rook. Magnus played knight f4. And the engine already thinks that black is winning in this position because obviously the rook on g1 doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm going to play d4 eventually. My knight's really strong on f4. I'm going to play d4. And I don't know what white's going to do. White's pieces are sort of trapped on the king side. Karjakin played queen g3, pinning the knight. The knight can't move because of queen takes queen on c7. So the queen moved to e7. And in this position, I was very confused. And I talked to the engine, because I talk to the engine sometimes. And I said, why did Karjakin make the next move that he made? And the engine said, well, black's winning anyway. The engine also doesn't like Karjakin's move, but it says if he makes the best move, he's still losing. Black is already dominating the f file, the e file, the knight on f4. The king is safer. And in this position, Karjakin made a move I would never consider. He sacrificed the exchange. And I like sacrificing the exchange, but I don't understand this one. Now, if I was white, I would be thinking I can play queen g6 and queen h7 check. Although, I mean, after queen g6, black can play like any move. White played knight e2. But if I play queen g6 and something like, let's say, queen f6 is played, and I check, the white queen is actually trapped. And white doesn't have any more pieces to attack with. That's it. So doesn't really get you anywhere. And I'm sure black has other moves other than queen f6, which are good, like queen g5 and either rook to f6. And I mean, if I sack the exchange on f4, I would play queen g6, even though it doesn't work. Sacking the exchange for nothing. Okay, so he played knight e2, attacking the rook, and this lets black trade more pieces, and Carlsen just traded into a winning endgame. Rook e8 threatening queen e1 check, and he played queen e1 check and traded pieces. So black's up in exchange for no pawns, so he moved his king up, and just a rook for a knight. There's nothing else going on. And in this position, Karjakin resigned because he's down material, and here comes my king to take everything. So it's a funny game because Magnus doesn't typically play the French very often at all, and it's hard to pinpoint what Karjakin did that was wrong. It seemed like black equalized, black got an advantage, black got a winning advantage, and he won. So it's a very good advertisement if you want to play the French with black, that somebody as strong as Karjakin, lost without doing anything particularly terrible. But that just shows you how good Magnus is. Okay. The other games were upsets. That wasn't an upset because Magnus better than Karjakin. The next game is from Linares 2003. Kasparov, Radjabov. And I remember when this game was played, Kasparov was pretty mad because he lost with white and people were congratulating Radjabov. But Radjabov definitely didn't win because of the opening, but maybe he surprised Kasparov. So French defense, knight c3, knight f6. This is the same as the last game. This is one of the main lines. And if you remember the last game, and this is like, you have to remember 10 minutes ago. So Magnus played bishop e7 against Karjakin. And Radjabov played a6, which Magnus also played a6, b5. He just played bishop e7 castles first. And, black wants to play b5 and play like Magnus did. Okay, queen d2, b5, a3, and I think Karjakin played a3 at some point also. Queen b6, and he played knight e2. And the idea that white has is to dominate d4 with pieces, and if necessary, play c3, and stop black from doing anything on the queen side, and then white can get going on the king side. Sometimes white will play f5 and knight f4 and start attacking on the king side. Okay, Radjabov played c4, which is unusual to take the tension away from the center. Kasparov played g4, h5, and typically white would prefer to play h3, but white can't play h3 because the h-pawn is pinned. So that doesn't work. So Kasparov took on h5. Kasparov wants to play on the king side, where he has space advantage. Rook h5, knight g3. The rook goes back, so that way if both players forget, black can still castle later. If the arbiter agrees, probably not. f5. So both sides are doing what they want to do. Black pushed all his pawns on the queen side. White's pushing all his pawns on the king side. Black still has this bad bishop. And the engine prefers white's position. Takes on f5. Now here, the engine actually wants to play h4. But Kasparov recaptured. We can't really blame him. And the knight's not protected now. And it's on the same line as the bishop. So that means any knight move that black makes threatens the knight on f5. Now, the problem with taking on e5, which attacks the knight, is when white recaptures, the queen is attacked. So that doesn't work. So he played knight f6. He wants to take the knight with the bishop. Knight went back to g3, and he played knight g4. The bishop saved itself. Bishop e6. c3, Kasparov closes off everything. Bishop e7, knight g5, castles. And in this position, Kasparov played knight takes e6, which the engine doesn't like. Typically, this bishop's not very good. It's a blockaded bishop. It can't really go anywhere active. So the engine wasn't very happy about this, but it still prefers white. Bishop e2. And in this position, the engine wants to play knight takes h2. Luckily, Radjabov didn't do that. And for a lecture of this length, with the kind of people who are watching it on YouTube and live, this move that black plays is too complicated, and I worry for some of our lower rated viewers, which is all of you, you'll be tempted to make crazy, insane moves like this. Even the engine doesn't like it, but at least I can explain it. Black played a move that I probably wouldn't consider, which is knight takes e5. And it's a piece sacrifice which the engine says white should accept. The engine says after bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop c5, that white has the advantage. Of course, black wants to play bishop f2 check, black wants to play d4, white can't legally castle kingside, and castling queenside loses the queen. So black's going to have an initiative against white's king on e1, and with opposite colored bishops, that's good for the attacking side. So black has compensation. The engine prefers white. However, if we take with the pawn, now the engine does not prefer white because black can play bishop c5 and d4 pretty quickly. I think it wants to play d4 now. And the engine actually says black is doing fine. Kasparov played a third move, which the engine also says is good for white, queen e3. So black won a pawn by taking on e5, but that opens up the bishop, and perhaps my queen's going to take on e6 if you move your knight. So queen e3 actually looks pretty annoying. Radjabov played knight d7, Kasparov played queen takes e6, and still the engine prefers white's position. Bishop h4 is correct, queen g4, g5, bishop to d2, rook e8, and white finally castles. That's a very late castling queenside in a chess game. You won't find many chess games where white castles queenside later than that. We're already deep into the game. Okay, knight a5. Obviously, knight b3 looks pretty reasonable. And he played the move rook f1, which is a mistake. And Kasparov in 2003, well, he knew who I was, but he probably didn't know any of my sayings. So if my students have white, they would play the correct move here. But Kasparov wasn't my student, so rook f1 is actually a blunder. The engine still slightly prefers white if white plays king b1. And what's going to happen here, for example, if it's black's turn to move, black can play queen g6, exactly, threatening knight b3 checkmate. I like what that alert was. It was to take out the garbage. Luckily, it was already taken out by somebody else. So If Kasparov plays king b1, he can hide on a2 and then proceed. And engine slightly prefers white. After rook f1, the engine says that black is winning. So knight b3 check. The point of rook f1 was to play king d1. Because you can't play king b1 now because you lose all your pieces. Okay, and Kasparov thought if you play queen g6, threatening queen b1, I can block on f5 with 3 different pieces. So I'm not really worried about queen g6. So he took the knight, and in this position, white has an issue. The issue is, if you take with the queen, I play queen g6, and you can't block on f5 anymore, so queen b1 is going to be annoying. And by annoying, I mean white resigns. And if you take with the pawn, so that your queen and rook defend f5, while your rook is also defending your other rook, so if I go here or take on h1 first, you can't defend this and go here. It's overworked. So bishop takes knight is winning for black. Kasparov played for tricks. He played rook f7, threatening queen takes knight check. Now, in this position, the engine says black is winning easily by playing queen c6. And then it says white has no good move. Because if white takes with the pawn, you lose your rook for nothing. And if you take with your queen, now you're not threatening the knight anymore. So I play queen g6. And queen b1 check, and so forth. Okay, but Radjabov didn't do that. He played rook d8, which is not as good as queen c6. Bishop takes g5, threatening the rook. Obviously, that wouldn't threaten the rook if the rook wasn't there. That's why queen c6 was better. Queen g6, threatening queen here check, and queen takes rook, and so forth. Queen f5, and they go into an ending where black is up a piece, and white has a pawn for the piece. But this knight is sort of almost semi-trapped here. So according to the engine, white can still fight a little bit if he plays h4, putting in an h. But Kasparov played bishop f3, bishop h4, and now the engine says that black's winning easily because black's up a piece and white doesn't have enough pawns. Knight c5 is a brilliant move. If you take it, then rook d8, and everything is getting attacked with check. So he played bishop f7, attacking the rook. And after knight d3, black is up a piece. Black's threatening knight b2. Black's threatening knight f2 check. The engine says black is like +4, and Kasparov resigned here. And Kasparov, at this point in his career, didn't lose with white very often. So this was a big upset that he lost to the French defense, especially after getting a reasonable opening. But if you're playing for a win and you have the black pieces and your opponent plays e4, you get these kind of structures where it's likely somebody's going to win. It's not boring. It's a very exciting game where both sides sort of did what they wanted to do, and then Kasparov messed up. So go Radjabov. And Kasparov retired a long time ago, but as of the making of this video, and for those of you who are watching live, Radjabov's playing in a tournament right now. He doesn't play very much, but he's playing in the UAE in this big tournament in Sharjah. Still plays occasionally. I think he's mainly a coach. Okay, now we didn't do enough Kasparov bashing, so let's do some more. This is his game against everybody's favorite player, Vassily Ivanchuk. Or, if you want his name pronounced correctly, Ivanchuk. But we'll pronounce it the American way, which is wrong. Okay, and since this game was played in 1995, Vassily has decided his name is not Vassily. He showed you. His name is now Vasyl. V-A-S-Y-L. I don't know. Okay, and this was played in Horgen, which I remember correctly is in Switzerland, and they would have an annual Super GM tournament. This is the one in 95. And here, Ivanchuk played the Winawar, and in this position, and in the next game we see them move a3. In this position, black almost always plays knight e7 and c5. However, in the 70s and 80s, black used to play a way that was championed by Yasser Seirawan, which is quite passive, but makes sense positionally. What happens in the Winawar is often white plays queen g4, attacking the g7 pawn. Black often takes the knight and doubles white's pawns, so white gets a kingside attack and white gets the two bishops. And positionally, it makes sense to play the move b6, because you want to play bishop a6 and trade off the white squared bishops. Because the bishop on c8 or b7 usually isn't very good, and sometimes the bishop on d3 is checkmating you. Okay, and after the move a3, Ivanchuk played a move that will confuse the audience. And I must say, I've played this way with black myself a long time ago. And that move is bishop f8, always play bishop f8. So black is saying, you can't play queen g4 and take on g7, that's out. And you don't have the two bishops. And I'm going to play c5, like I like to do in the French. And I'm going to play bishop a6 and trade bishops. So strategically, eventually black will be better by attacking in the center and trading off his bad bishop. Kasparov played knight f3, knight e7, put it in h, attack on the king side. a5, black attacks on the queen side. Bishop b5 check. Kasparov's hoping for bishop d7, then he'll go back to d3, and black can't play bishop a6 trading the bishop. But Ivanchuk's not doing that. And he plays bishop a4 to avoid trading bishops. And white has a very long, complicated plan, which you're actually going to see, which is common in this variation. White doesn't want to trade the white squared bishops, so white plays bishop b3, bishop a2, bishop b1, knight e2, c3, and if bishop a2 is enforced, he can play knight e2, c3, bishop c2, and leave black with this bishop. So both sides are losing a lot of time to get the position that they want. Knight d7, and now if you're playing bug house, knight d7 is quite a bad move, because white will place the knight on d6 with checkmate. But they're not playing bug house, so black is fine. Knight e2, Kasparov wants to play c3, b5, c5, and of course, Kasparov plays c3. So Kasparov avoided trading the bishops, so he's happy. His knight can go to g3 or f4. He's got advantage in the center. So the engine says white is slightly better. Knight c6, castles, queen c7, rook e1, c4. Players aren't doing very much. Bishop f4, bishop e7, rook b8. And up until now, both sides are playing very well. Black is gaining space on the queen side. Black wants to play b4. White wants to attack on the king side, but black hasn't acquiesced to castling king side. So if white goes totally nuts and starts moving all of his pieces here and sacking them, black's king can run away. So Kasparov is sort of waiting for Ivanchuk to castle so he can start the king side attack, but Ivanchuk's not castling. King is very safe on e8 because the center is closed. Okay, knight h2. Kasparov wants to play f4, f5, knight g4, knight f4, queen g4. Typical attacking ideas for white. Queen to d8, always retreat. He wants to defend this diagonal more. Knight g4, b4, and up until now, the players are playing about the same strength, and I guess white is slightly better. For the rest of the game, Kasparov is incomprehensible. From now until the end of the game, Kasparov just played badly. Like, if he played this in a blitz game the rest of the game, Kramnik wouldn't accuse him of anything. That's how badly he played. He took on b4. Took on b4 again, which is terrible. This is where black is playing. White wants to play on the king side. So taking on b4 actually helps black. And then in this position, uncharacteristic, he played b3. I mean, black is playing on the queen side, so white should be playing on the king side. b3 is a terrible move. And already black is better because the players are fighting on the queen side where all of black's pieces are. And you can see that white's very passive on the queen side, and black is very aggressive. And now, typically in the French, we like to attack the pawn, but Kasparov took with the c pawn, undefending his pawn. His knight on f3, which was defending his pawn, went to g4. The queen on d1 that was defending his pawn went to e2. So all of a sudden, nothing is defending this pawn. Knight e3. Ivanchuk says thank you. And this is just completely winning for black. I don't understand queen f1. I got nothing. Castles. And Kasparov, disgusted with himself, just resigned. And I'm guessing Kasparov's idea when he played queen f1 was to play rook e4, which looks like it wins the c pawn. But I guess after queen b2, threatening the bishop, and the bishop's trapped. So now you're not going to win the pawn on c4. So after castles, black has an extra passed pawn. White's pieces are all ridiculous on the back row. The bishop is blocked by the pawn. Black is just winning. And Kasparov resigned. So that's a terribly played game by Kasparov. And it's 2 games in a row against the French where Kasparov got reasonable position, but then just got outplayed and got confused. And, well, that's how I won a lot of games in the French. The engine may not have liked my game, but it was very complicated, and I had a lot of experience. Because when I was a teenager, all my games were French defenses. Okay, and the last game is one of the most famous because it's a game Fischer lost to relatively unknown player, Kovacevic. There's actually more than one Kovacevic or Kovacevic. And this is the line that Fischer used to beat my dad in 1963. And supposedly the Yugoslavian players, they were preparing to have black in this line, waiting for one of their guys to play Fischer. And Fischer in the Winawar would play the variation with a3, basically played only by Fischer. And he played it a lot. And this is his game with my dad from 1963. And in this position, my dad played the move rook to g6, which is okay. Nothing wrong with rook g6. And Fischer won a very long bishop and pawn endgame against my dad. Kovacevic played knight bd7. He leaves the queen on h6. Knight e2, b6. My dad actually played knight bd7 and b6, but he threw rook g6, queen e3 in first. A slightly different position. And Fischer tried to take advantage of the fact that his queen is on h6 and not on e3 by playing bishop g5. You will notice if black had played rook g6 and white had played queen e3, that bishop g5 is quite illegal. The bishop can't jump over the queen. Well, the queen's not on e3, so bishop g5. Queen e7, queen h4, bishop b7, knight g3, and h6. Of course, white wants to play knight h5. That's a lot of pressure on f6. So he sacrifices a pawn to kick the bishop away. He plays bishop d2. He wants to take with the queen, not the bishop. And knight f8 is a brilliant move to play the move knight g6 and put Fischer's queen in peril. So Fischer playing bishop g5, queen h4, that didn't work out very well because the queen's getting trapped on h4. And in this position, the engine already says black is winning because black's king is much safer than white's king. Black is very happy that he doesn't have any h or g pawns because he has open files for his rooks. White has no attack against the black king. And in the game Fischer beat my dad in 63, Fischer actually castled queenside. They both castled queenside, so, but not this game. Okay, f3, never play f3. e3, a brilliant move, sacrificing a pawn. And then he plays knight f8, trying to win the queen. The queen can't go to e3 because black played e3 in this position. If black played knight f8 now, probably white would play queen e3. And in this position, if you play queen takes e3 right away, I can play knight d5. And again, your queen's in a lot of trouble. And my queen's going to h4, and my knight's going to f4, and so forth. So Fischer, after knight f8, had to move his queen over to b5. Knight to d5 attacks the bishop, and it also releases the f6 square so the queen can go to h4. Now, before Kovacevic plays queen h4, he has to make sure Fischer doesn't play queen e8 checkmate. Then you can play queen h4. Fischer defends his bishop with his king, trying to escape what's going to happen to him over here, but there's no escape. a6, so the queen can't go to e8. Rook takes h2. Queen h4, threatening the knight on g3. Takes. If you take the knight, I can play king g1 defending my rook. So he takes the rook. Now the knight on g3 is hanging. Knight f1, attacking the queen. Rook g2 check. Obviously, white is getting crushed on the king side. Queen h4 check. King d2. Knight g6. And material is equal, but white has a terrible pawn structure, and white has a terrible king, and all of black's pieces are crushing white. So the game ended quickly. Rook e1, knight f4, takes, queen e3, and a very nice finishing move, which took me a long time to understand, because I guess I'm slow. Many moves win, but I really like the move rook f2. Rook f2 has two threats. It's very hard to stop either one of them. One is to take the bishop, and if the rook takes, your knight's hanging. That's why you played rook f2. The other is to play knight g2, forking the queen and rook. Since you can't stop both, in fact, I'm not sure you can stop either, Fischer resigned here. So he basically got rolled over in his pet variation that his opponent and colleagues had prepared to play against him, knowing that he played this way, and they had their secret illegal preparation without engines, unless they had engines in 1970. So back to the drawing board for Fischer in that line, and since he quit chess 2 years later, he didn't really have a chance to improve and play better for white. And basically, after this game, and since Fischer stopped playing chess in 72, nobody played this line anymore. So it was a Fischer specialty. These guys tried to refute it. Relatively unknown player beat Fischer, and then people stopped playing this variation for white, and it's not popular anymore. So the death of a variation. Anyway, I want to thank our sponsor, Tom Gall, again, and hopefully his dad's watching and recovering. This is for you. And if you'd like to sponsor a lecture, please contact my wife, Karen. Her email is karen@hclchessclub.com. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with more weekly lectures. Bye, everybody.